Nobody expected that a 17-year-old kid in a worn hoodie would become the catalyst for a movement that would sweep across the nation. What started as a simple act of roadside assistance would end up exposing the hidden depths of human compassion in the most unlikely of heroes. On the shoulder of a forgotten highway between two sleepy towns in Georgia, an old Buick sat tilted on three wheels, rain puddles reflecting the gray morning sky around it. The sparse pine trees stood like silent witnesses to what would become one of the most powerful moments ever captured on film. Behind the wheel sat an elderly woman in a knitted cardigan, her tired eyes darting more often to the rearview mirror than to the road ahead, as if expecting help that might never come. She had been calling the tow service for over an hour, but no one had shown up. The isolation of this stretch of highway made every passing minute feel like an eternity. Her fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as she contemplated her options, none of which seemed particularly promising for a woman her age stranded in the middle of nowhere. The sound of squeaking brakes cut through the morning silence. An old Toyota Corolla, its paint faded and bumper slightly dented, pulled up behind the disabled Buick. From it emerged a tall, lanky teenager who moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned early in life that sudden movements could be misinterpreted. His hoodie had seen better days, and the backpack slung over his shoulder suggested he might be heading to or from school, though at this hour it was hard to tell which. "Everything okay, ma'am?" he asked, approaching with the kind of cautious respect that spoke of good upbringing and genuine concern. His voice carried a slight southern drawl, soft and reassuring. The woman looked up at him through her rolled-down window, taking in his appearance with the quick assessment that comes naturally to those who have lived long enough to be wary. But something in his eyes, a sincere concern that couldn't be faked, made her shoulders relax slightly. "Flat tire," she said, nodding toward the deflated rubber. "I'm afraid I'm not much good with these things anymore." "You got a spare?" he asked, already walking around to assess the situation. "Somewhere in the trunk, I hope," she replied, fumbling with her keys. Without another word, he popped the trunk and began rummaging through the accumulated detritus of a long life well lived. Old blankets, emergency supplies, a first aid kit that looked like it had never been opened, and finally, nestled beneath it all, a spare tire that looked as old as the car itself, but seemed serviceable enough. He worked with quiet efficiency, the kind that comes from years of helping his mother with weekend car trouble, and learning that sometimes actions spoke louder than lengthy explanations. The jack went under the car with practiced precision, and within minutes he had the vehicle lifted and was working the lug nuts loose with steady, rhythmic motions. His hands moved with surprising skill for someone his age, suggesting this wasn't his first roadside emergency. The whole operation took less than 10 minutes. When he lowered the car back down and tested the wheel, it held firm and true. He packed the flat tire and tools back into the trunk with the same methodical care he had used to retrieve them, making sure everything was secure and in its proper place. "There you go," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Should get you where you're going." The woman reached for her purse, but he was already shaking his head before she could speak. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude that went deeper than simple appreciation for automotive assistance. "No need to, ma'am," he replied with a smile that transformed his entire face, revealing the kind of warmth that made strangers feel like old friends. "Just drive safe, okay?" He gave a small wave and walked back to his car, never offering his name or asking for anything in return. As he drove away, the woman sat in her car for a moment longer, watching his taillights disappear around a bend in the road. Something about the encounter had moved her in a way she couldn't quite articulate, though she wouldn't understand the full significance of that feeling until much later. 3 months passed like pages turning in a book, each day blending into the next in the comfortable routine of small-town life. The incident on the highway became one of those stories that gets filed away in memory, occasionally surfacing during conversations about the kindness of strangers or the state of the world today, but otherwise settling into the background of daily existence point. Then, one Tuesday morning, everything changed. The parking lot of Lakeview Heights High School suddenly erupted with unfamiliar activity. A white van with the logo of a major television network pulled up near the main entrance, followed by 2 more vehicles loaded with equipment that looked far too sophisticated for a typical school visit. Cameras, lighting rigs, and sound equipment emerged from the vehicles like the components of some elaborate technological orchestra, all coordinated by people wearing headsets and carrying clipboards with the kind of focused intensity that suggested something significant was about to happen. Teachers paused in their morning routines to peer through classroom windows at the commotion outside. Students pressed their faces against the glass, whispering theories about what could possibly bring television cameras to their small-town school. The excitement was palpable, the kind of electric anticipation that comes when the outside world suddenly takes notice of a place that usually exists far from any spotlight. In the midst of all this activity, Jaden Brooks sat on a bench near the athletic building, completely oblivious to the production taking shape around him. He was focused on the mundane task of cleaning his sneakers, using an old toothbrush to work mud from the treads, with the kind of methodical attention to detail that characterized everything he did. The same careful approach that had made changing a tire look effortless was now applied to footwear maintenance, because in his world, taking care of what you had was just as important as helping others with what they needed. Jaden Brooks? The voice belonged to a woman with silver-gray curls and the kind of confident bearing that suggested she was used to being in charge of complicated situations. He looked up from his sneakers, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise over a familiar landscape. "You," he said simply. Eleanor Spencer looked different now. Gone was the vulnerable elderly woman in the cardigan, replaced by someone who moved with purpose and authority. Her clothes were tailored, her posture spoke of boardrooms and decision-making, but her eyes held the same gratitude that had shone through that morning on the highway. "You don't know me? Not really?" she said, settling onto the bench beside him with the careful deliberation of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. "My name is Eleanor Spencer. I'm a documentary filmmaker. My work has been nominated for Emmy Awards, screened at film festivals, and broadcast to millions of viewers. For the past 3 months, I've been working on a project about spontaneous acts of kindness, and you, Jaden Brooks, are the reason this film exists." He blinked, trying to process information that seemed to belong in someone else's life. "I just helped with your tire." She nodded, and for the first time since she had appeared, her professional composure cracked slightly, revealing something more personal underneath. "And we filmed it all." The explanation that followed sounded like something from a movie rather than real life. Eleanor had been conducting what she called a social experiment, driving predetermined routes with hidden cameras installed in her vehicle, documenting how people responded to someone in apparent distress. It was part of a larger project she had titled Invisible Heroes, designed to explore whether genuine altruism still existed in an increasingly disconnected world. Over the course of 6 months, she had staged dozens of similar scenarios across the Southeast. Cars with mechanical problems, lost tourists asking for directions, elderly people struggling with heavy packages in parking lots. The results had been discouraging. Most people simply walked or drove past, absorbed in their own concerns, and perhaps suspicious of any interaction with strangers. Even those who did stop often seemed motivated more by obligation than genuine desire to help, their assistance grudging and minimal. Then came that morning in Georgia, when a 17-year-old kid had proven that kindness wasn't dead, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The premiere took place 3 weeks later in a theater that seemed impossibly grand to someone who had never been anywhere more formal than the local movie multiplex. Jaden sat between his mother and the school principal, holding a ticket that identified him as a special guest, though he still wasn't entirely sure what made him special. The theater was packed with people who looked important, the kind of individuals who attended premieres and spoke in the confident tones of those accustomed to being heard. When the lights dimmed and the screen came alive, Jaden watched himself change a tire. But somehow, through Eleanor's lens and editing, the simple act had been transformed into something more profound. The camera caught details he hadn't noticed at the time. The careful way he had approached her car, the genuine concern in his voice, the fact that he had never hesitated or looked around to see if anyone was watching. Most powerfully, it captured the look on Eleanor's face as he worked, the gradual transformation from wariness to wonder as she realized she was witnessing something increasingly rare in the modern world. The film didn't end with the tire change. Eleanor had spent months tracking down others like Jaden, ordinary people who had performed extraordinary acts of kindness when they thought no one was looking. A cashier who had paid for groceries when a customer's card was declined. A businessman who had given up his first-class seat to a military family. A group of teenagers who had spent their weekend cleaning up a park without being asked. But Jaden's story anchored it all, the opening sequence that set the tone for everything that followed. By the time the credits rolled, there wasn't a dry eye in the theater. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days of its broadcast debut, Invisible Heroes had been viewed millions of times across various platforms. Social media exploded with stories from people inspired to perform their own acts of kindness, each one tagged with # Invisible Hero in recognition of the movement Eleanor had sparked and Jaden had ignited. Letters began arriving at the school, addressed to Jaden from people across the country who had been moved by his story. College admissions offices called with scholarship offers. A university in Atlanta offered him a full ride, covering not just tuition but living expenses and books. Local businesses wanted to sponsor him. A national restaurant chain offered him a part-time job with flexible hours and benefits that extended to his family. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had never sought the spotlight. Jaden found himself giving interviews to reporters who wanted to understand what had motivated his actions on that highway morning. Television producers called with offers for follow-up appearances. A publisher reached out about a book deal, though he couldn't imagine having enough to say to fill more than a few pages. Through it all, he remained remarkably unchanged. He still cleaned his sneakers with the same methodical care, still helped his mother with weekend errands, still approached each day with the quiet determination that had always characterized his approach to life. When asked by reporters what he planned to do with his newfound opportunities, he spoke about studying engineering, maybe specializing in sustainable energy or infrastructure development, fields where he could help solve problems that affected entire communities rather than just individuals. The question that followed him everywhere was the simplest and perhaps the most important. Why had he stopped? In interview after interview, his answer remained consistent, delivered with the same unassuming directness that had characterized his original act of kindness. "I don't know," he would say, scratching his head with a gesture that had become familiar to anyone who had seen him on screen. "I guess I just thought about my grandmother. She's 83 and still drives, though maybe she shouldn't. I'd want someone to help her if she got stuck somewhere like that." It was such a simple explanation, but it contained multitudes. In those few words, he had captured something essential about human connection and responsibility. The idea that we are all linked by invisible threads of mutual dependence and care. His grandmother had become everyone's grandmother. His concern had become everyone's concern, and his willingness to act had become a reminder of what was possible when people chose to see beyond their own immediate needs. Eleanor's film had won the Emmy she had been chasing for years, but more importantly, it had started conversations about kindness, community, and the power of individual actions to create ripple effects that extended far beyond their original scope. Schools began incorporating Invisible Heroes into their curricula, using it as a starting point for discussions about citizenship and social responsibility. The highway where it all began became something of a pilgrimage site, with people making detours to drive past the spot where Jaden had changed Eleanor's tire. Someone had installed a small memorial plaque on a tree near where the incident occurred, though Jaden himself thought that was a bit much for something so ordinary. But perhaps that was the point. The extraordinary had emerged from the utterly ordinary, and in doing so, had reminded everyone that heroism didn't require special powers or dramatic circumstances. Sometimes it just required stopping when someone needed help, offering assistance without expecting anything in return, and treating strangers with the same care you would want shown to the people you loved most. As months passed and the initial media frenzy died down, Jaden settled into his new reality with the same steady approach he brought to everything else. He accepted the scholarship to study engineering, though he deferred for a year to help his mother with some health issues that had been neglected while money was tight. He used some of the unexpected financial opportunities that had come his way to ensure she received proper medical care, an act of kindness that never made the news but meant more to him than all the public recognition combined. When he finally did start college, he carried with him the lessons of that morning on the highway, not as burdens, but as guides. He joined organizations focused on community service, not because it was expected of someone with his public profile, but because it felt like a natural extension of values he had held long before anyone knew his name. He studied hard, worked part-time jobs despite not needing the money, and maintained the kind of quiet integrity that had made him worth filming in the first place. The story that had begun with a flat tire continued to unfold in ways both large and small. Eleanor went on to make other documentaries, but none captured the public imagination quite like invisible heroes. She established a foundation that provided scholarships to young people who demonstrated exceptional kindness and community service, with Jaden serving on the selection committee during his school breaks. The woman whose tire he had changed became a symbol of something larger than herself, though she handled the attention with the same grace she had shown that morning on the highway. She used her newfound platform to advocate for better infrastructure funding and emergency services in rural areas, turning her personal experience into broader social advocacy. Years later, when Jaden had graduated and begun his career as an engineer specializing in renewable energy systems, he still carried business cards in his wallet with the number for roadside assistance. Not because he expected to need it, but because he had learned that being prepared to help others was just as important as being prepared to help yourself. The documentary continued to find new audiences, screened in schools and community centers, shared on social media by people who wanted to remind their friends that kindness mattered. Each viewing sparked new conversations, inspired new acts of generosity, and reminded viewers that they had the power to be heroes in their own ordinary moments. And sometimes, late at night when the world felt particularly complicated and divided, people would remember a 17-year-old kid in a worn hoodie who had stopped to help a stranger, not because cameras were rolling or because anyone would ever know, but simply because it was the right thing to do. In those moments, the possibility of a kinder world didn't seem so far-fetched after all. The story of Jaden Brooks had become larger than any single person or moment, but at its heart, it remained beautifully simple. One person had chosen to help another, and that choice had reminded everyone watching that such choices were always available, always meaningful, and always capable of changing the world in ways both seen and unseen. In the end, perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all. Heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments captured on film. It was about showing up when someone needed help, offering assistance without expecting recognition, and treating every encounter as an opportunity to make the world slightly better than it had been before. It was about remembering that we are all connected, all vulnerable, and all capable of being the help that someone else desperately needs. The highway in Georgia still sees traffic every day, people traveling between forgotten towns on their way to somewhere else. Most pass by without stopping, focused on their destinations and their own concerns. But some remember a story about a teenager and a tire, and they drive a little more carefully, watch a little more closely for people who might need help, and carry with them the knowledge that ordinary moments can become extraordinary simply through the choice to care about someone other than themselves. And somewhere, in a world that often seems short on kindness, that makes all the difference.